Welcome to Quiet Spaces. This episode looks at thin places and was recorded in 2021. The first part is based on Matthew 27, verses 45 to 54. Okay, so we'll start off. We'll go to the next slide now. Hope you enjoyed your time in the breakout rooms. So we'll have a reading from the Bible now. I'm going to read Matthew 27, and what may be considered a very thin place and moment at the time Jesus died on the cross. So from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." So go to the next slide and over to Judy.
Right, so let's just look at this a little bit more. As you can see, we're told in the reading, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. Well, I don't know about you, but I've travelled, as it were, through many Holy Weeks, journeying with Jesus on his way to the cross. And each time I think it's sort of felt a bit different. And sometimes I felt that I was almost present there at Calvary on that first Good Friday. And in other years, I felt more present at other events of that very special week. So I think what I'm saying is that Jesus' passion and death can feel very different to us at different times. But having read these rather stark, strong words again, I'm reminded of a rather special Holy Week when I was back in Brighton and Hove a few years ago now, but one that I'll always remember. We'd been asked to try out worshipping in other churches, perhaps places with a slightly different tradition during that particular Holy Week. And a friend and I decided we'd go to St. Luke's, a place where we'd been before, to some pioneer events and worship. And St. Luke's that year, we're going to use a unique form of the Tenebrae service. Tenebrae is something that's often used during the few days before Easter, which meant that much of the service would be in darkness, stillness, and silence. We were focusing on the whole passage, of which we've just read some parts. So let's imagine a large old church, quite chilly, pretty dark anyway, with most of the seats removed to create a different atmosphere. And we were walking in the middle of Holy Week to just a little candlelit building. It felt pretty special, and there was an air of expectation. And what they did is that they narrated the story in Matthew 27 quite slowly and deliberately. And then they acted a few parts out very simply, just with 4 people. And as soon as the narrating began, the candles were extinguished very slowly. So it was getting darker and darker. And there were silent pauses between some of the verses for us to reflect and or pray. It already felt very moving. And I'm really sorry, but I can't quite portray the climax of the short service in the way that it happened that day. It's almost impossible. I'll have a go. The narrator spoke the words, "From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. And suddenly we were in total darkness and silence. And then, with impeccable timing, we heard the haunting ripping of an enormous sheet. as the narrator continued. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The timing and the drama were spot on. And it actually felt as if we'd been there at Calvary, experiencing that moment for real. It was an enormously thin moment.
I'd like to talk about a particular thin moment I had. It's very, very memorable to me, and it was actually before I became a Christian. So at the time, I didn't even know what it was. I've always remembered it as being something I couldn't explain really. I was age 20 and riding a ski lift in Austria. I remember the blanket of snow going on forever in the distance, the rocky peaks, the trees, and singularly so spectacular, but put together, it just became something very special. I had a feeling I just couldn't describe. And I guess because I wasn't yet a Christian, I just couldn't account for it, but it's always stuck in my mind ever since. And it kind of makes sense now. And I really think that was a thin place and moment, where the veil between the earth and the kingdom must have been thin. And for me, mountains are always quite thin, really. That experience and my feeling with mountains has actually resulted in me in spending 5 ski seasons in the Austrian Alps after that. And like now, as we as a family, when I go skiing, it just feels like I'm coming home when I first see the mountains. It's just something I just can't explain it, because we all see beautiful things, think, oh, that's look really pretty or whatever. But it's more than that. It really is more, something I can't describe. And ironically, it was actually a Christian ski holiday that planted the seeds of becoming a Christian. So I think, I don't think anybody understands exactly what a thin place is or a thin moment. It's just a total mystery. And perhaps, it's something with our senses we have at the moment, our eyes, etc. It's something we can't really understand. We don't have the senses to understand it. But we know that we're close. We're getting close. We're actually sort of feel a closeness to God.
Mm.
So there's an appropriate photo of mountains. I couldn't get the exact scene of where I was, unfortunately, because all my photos aren't digital from then. But it's a mountain scene.
Beautiful.
So put you over to Judy now, who's going to describe her experience at the Holy Land.
Yes, it's strange really, because I was trying to think what could I share, that I could even begin to explain, and sort of probably what sort of deep feeling it had for me. I mean, I think I've been quite sensitive to special places probably most of my life, but for this particular one, perhaps because it was so strong, I decided this should be the one that I share with you now anyway. So there we were, Jerusalem, the holy city, a place I'd heard of all of my life, really, a place where Jesus had been so often and where he died and risen again. So this picture here shows roughly the first proper view I had of Jerusalem, looking down from the Mount of Olives, with a beautiful golden dome of the rock dominating the striking, almost unbelievable scene, because when you first get there for the first time, you keep thinking, am I really here? Is this really it? All those sorts of thoughts going through your head. And I couldn't really believe we were there. But Jerusalem is also where my cousin Marion has lived for over 40 years now. But on this first visit, she'd only been there for a relatively short while. And all I could think about really was that I was just longing to see her again. Her mum had said to me over the years, because she visited often, oh, you must go and visit. Jerusalem will change your life forever. And I was thinking, oh, yeah. But anyway, so when I was standing here that time, little did I know that later on, a place so near to that beautiful golden dome would become sketched and etched in my heart, mind and soul forever. So fast forwarding a few hours, I went off for a walk that evening through the Damascus Gate and into the darkened souk with 4 others, including our then parish priest. This was back in Brighton, who was leading our pilgrimage. It was very dark in the souk, so we couldn't see much. And so for my friend Eleanor and I, it became an opportunity to just catch up and chat as we went along and to plan what we wanted to do in the next few days. We passed through several checkpoints, already getting used to the guns held by most of the soldiers, some of whom seemed to be only in their early teens. I remember walking down a lot of steps, chatting with the others now as we watched our footsteps very carefully because there was hardly any light to see by. And what happened next is really quite hard to tell, as I don't remember why it happened, only that it did happen. I was in mid-sentence talking about something or other when I suddenly grabbed Eleanor's arm and I gasped and I said, "I feel as if I've come home." And then I burst into tears. Well, my vicar was rather concerned and said, "Well, you know where you are, don't you?" Well, I didn't, of course. And then he pointed across an enormous piazza towards a wall in the distance where he was sort of peering, "Oh, where can we be? It's quite dark, can't really see." But where I saw consciously for the first time the Western or the Wailing Wall. And so I cried again, and Father Trevor promised that we would visit the wall again a couple of days later. And I think we went back about 3 times eventually. And it had been an astounding moment, almost unbelievable. And I think it was several months before I could even really try to explain it. So, and going back those other times, sort of, I had the same sort of feelings, a feeling of, I'm not really quite sure. It was something so deep, and I did feel very close to God. They were really intense and just almost indescribable feelings. And then especially, you can see the mostly young ladies here, on the woman's part of the wall, because unfortunately, even now, the men and women by the Jewish tradition are segregated from each other. And I'd written some names on those little post-it notes of people I wanted to pray for, of friends and family and colleagues back home. And then I pushed them into those little cracks that you can see in the wall. And that again was I mean, even now, talking about it, I can feel it as a very, very thin moment, sort of almost making the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But when I got back to England and thought more about the Western Wall and the moments I'd felt, I think then I started to be able to describe it in a sort of way. And the only thing I can think of is that it felt as if God was there in that place, a site which is holy to Jews, Christians and Muslims, and probably actually to a whole lot of other people who don't realise, because so many people do get this wonderful feeling there. And that God's love and his care radiates out from there. And it felt to me almost like an enormous and eternal hug. So those experiences there were some of the most powerful experiences I've had of thin places. And my auntie was right. Visiting Jerusalem certainly did change my life forever. And I think Karen's now going to share something with us about Holy Week.
Yeah, this was an experience. This is I think it's more of a thin moment than a thin place. I'd been a Christian for around 6 months. It was my first ever Holy Week. And I'd just like to share immediately after that week. I just had to write about it. And I just want to, if you don't mind, I'm just going to include a few excerpts from what I wrote at the time, if that's okay. So just to give you the background, when I was a new Christian, when I entered Holy Week, Jesus was living in books and stories, and it was really all about me instead of being all about him. And then at the end, I ended Holy Week with Jesus living in my heart and a feeling of deep joy. So I'll just give you a few quotes, which probably shows how I felt more than if I tried to describe it. So I'll start with that. Up until now, Easter has always been about weighing up my desire for copious amounts of Easter eggs versus how much weight gain this would involve. Now it means something entirely different. My week has been full of images, words, light, dark, silence, contemplation, and joy. A week of focusing on Christ with like-minded friends. The week began with it all being about me instead of being all about him. This all about me sentiment stayed with me until Thursday's midnight vigil and the altar of repose. Something then changed inside of me. As I sat in silence, I was totally immersed in the vision of the altar of repose, which I've actually got a photo of there on the screen. The beauty, the sadness, the dark, the light, the stillness, the movement. And then the facts then changed to feelings, and Holy Week and the crucifixion really entered my heart. Then when we came to Easter Sunday, oh, what a joy, he is risen. There was a point in the service when it was proclaimed that Christ is risen, and sunlight streamed into the church at that very moment. And my mood changed from sadness, silence, and contemplation to one of joyous celebration. That joy has stayed ever since. It was a real shift in my whole Christian journey, really. So thanks for letting me share that. I want to pass you back to Judy now.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Karen, because it's a wonderful feeling. And as we say, that we do talk about thin places and thin moments, but they are also thin feelings. It's like when you feel a place rather than just look at it and say, isn't it beautiful? But as at the beginning, people often ask what we mean by a thin place. Places usually captivate our imagination, yet they almost minimize our existence. We become very small, yet we feel as if we've gained a connection and that we've become part of something larger that we can perceive. A thin place is a place where one feels that indefinable, mysterious power that Gandhi refers to. Gandhi believed and stated later in the same speech that the mysterious power he felt was God. And in a way, they say that thin places shouldn't be confused with thin moments, beautiful and profound as they are, and important to us in other ways. But a thin place is simply that, a place where the veil is thin. A place that, and you can see some of them there, that where the place itself draws us into itself, transports us into something mysterious, yet so hard to describe. There's pictures there of Cornwall, of Iona, one with the rainbows in the Midwest of America, and then some of Karen's mountains. I don't know whether they're the exact ones. And then a desert scene just outside Jerusalem, where again there are lots and lots of thin places. Sometimes people feel that it's because it's been a place of prayer, where different things have happened, sometimes just that life has happened. But, and again, we don't all feel the same thinness in the same thin places, if you see what I mean. You know, you may go to somewhere really beautiful and really appreciate its beauty, and yet you don't feel that intense feeling that you can get in another thin place, and you think, well, why did I get that here? So it is always very mysterious. Yet once we've been in a thin place, or perhaps it's wrapped itself around us, and we've found our spirit absorbing something that we can't quite put our finger on. We can't name it or describe it. But from that moment, there's no real need for any description. We just know, and we're aware that we're feeling it.